show on the road here. Welcome to Evolution Hour from fire-ravaged Spokane, Washington. Isn't that exciting? In our little website. Here we go. And let me also put up our patrons. Okay, there we go. And thank you all for helping the project. Our colleagues, Hendro, Eric, and Cyrus, researchers, Barbara, Ian, Convertney, Stephen, Early, James, History Minor, Apologia, Ralph, Benjamin, Slava, Speed of Sound, the M-Wing, our assistant researchers, Cyborg, Daranku, Scott, Christian, Lavender Lady, our friends, Bats, Eric, Gale, My Unfinished Journey, Nana, Morton Nielsen, Bo. Would be way more difficult to pull any of this off. So let's get that closed up there and that closed up there. And I think we are operational. Yay. Okay, if I can just get rid of some of these stupid little menus that keep on flailing in front of my eyeballs here on the screen. Hey, God. Boy. Most eccentric. Anyway, as you know, we are continuing through the source analysis of our dear book, Titans, from 2022, Jonathan Sarfati and Mr. Tay, and trying to piece together what sources we're on. We're on chapter 2, and we are slogging through their constant repetition of the mantras as they're going into the early years of paleontology. We shall get to that in a moment. I will get part 2 out of the way right up front, which relates to a neat little post. Gary Bates from just last year on the Valley of the Whales, a famous desert full of marine fossils. Maybe not. Bates is diving into a trove of whale fossils in Egypt. And by the way, there are quite a few of them from that period, 35 million years ago, around in that period. And as the Tethys Sea is kind of fading away and whales are evolving and all that stuff. But Dex stacks his claims and avoids any technical citations. Even though there are technical papers available on it by 2022, somehow he neglects to mention any of that. Anyway, he's got a claim that, quote, many of the fossils found at Wadi al-Hitan are almost identical to living creatures today, such as crocodiles and dugongs. Although their fossils have been classified as different species, they are just variations of their biblical kind, as we see with many living creatures today, unquote. But doesn't actually cite any technical literature on it. He somehow managed to neglect to mention the primitive elephant, Maratherium, which was discussed by a 2008 paper, not exactly a news bulletin here, which I will be putting a link to, by the way, in the finished product. But nonetheless, Bates insists, quote, if these formations are being shaped and eroded before our eyes, then surely after an alleged 35 plus million years, they would have eroded away completely. This is one of the major problems with the view that this fossil site is tens of millions of years old, unquote. So, let's compare with some of the science. From 2009, again, not exactly cutting edge material, there's a paper from Peters on the depositional details. And specifically regarding whales, they noted, rapid burial is thus not required in order for marine vertebrates to occur as complete and semi-articulated to articulated skeletons on traceable stratigraphic surfaces. Uh-oh. It's almost like there's a reason why Bates is not going to be citing any of the technical literature. A 2014 paper from King, I will also be putting a link up to that little puppy, makes it clear there's a large amount of erosion in the excavated stretches that they're dealing with between the protected outcrops, which means that an awful lot of stuff did in fact erode away over all of that time. How much of the geological details did Bates bring out in his paper, in his little piece? Well, you can read for yourself. Nothing. And then there's a paper, 2019 from Guy et al. On further details of the paleo environment that they were able to work out about all of that, about mangrove roots and exactly what's happening with the whale-bearing group and how critters can get washed in and the like in this estuary. And I mean, it's all the implication that there's all land critters identical to forms that exist now, rather than a swampy environment where things can get washed in and little articulated pieces or disarticulated pieces can come in. Just compare the two papers to the Nothing Burger. Bates, of course, can't cite anybody who's really a creationist authority on this subject because they don't have any. Anyway, this one's going to be mentioned in more detail in Rocks Were There Volume 2, which we're going to be having a very extensive coverage of how creationists have mangled whale evolution over the years, and this will be another one on that. So back up to our main event, which is good old Sarfati Tay. Scan my little page of crib notes up here. Whoops. There we go. So Sarfati brings up an old creationist post from 2017 on dragons in the British Museum, which is a pretty generic discussion of fossil finds. And so I've been struck by how he does these little tactical footnoting where he's not making any outrageous claim based on the creationist source, but it's still underpinning everything as the creationist spin. And the problem is that when you look at the paper in question, that anybody that would be reading this material, who would be going to the sources Sarfati cites, would be finding a lot more there than what he's bringing up, and therefore buffering with a lot of ideology, rather than, of course, citing regular scholarly literature, which would bring up unpleasant things like facts that don't fit into their framework. Anyway, I found it interesting in that Hunter piece that there was in it a mention of Anning, who we discussed in previous show, about her various finds, and perfectly laudatory, but he notes that she is a devout Christian, but complains that her work, quote, contributed to our understanding of ancient marine life, undoubtedly deposited at the time of Noah's flood, though unfortunately history has claimed her as a champion of evolution, unquote. Well, I don't think anybody has ever claimed that Anning was an evolutionist, but they do claim, and we quoted some material on her, that she was very skeptical of the idea that all the geologic material that she was seeing from her own observation came from that flood. So it's the person who's trying to hijack her view is Hunter, not evolutionists. Of course, they didn't mention any of all of that material. Now, it gets a little bit more fun because at this point, Sarfati and Tay play a bit of golden oldie incestuous citation, because he finds a reason to bring up horse evolution, and he cites himself from 1999 to dismiss all of that. Now, never mind that the Ark Encounter, existing by 2022, has Dinohippus, a transitional fossil, as the original created horse kind, which, by the way, is a taxon that is not mentioned in that Sarfati piece, which is just ridiculously obsolete, even on the horse issue. So once again, you've got the bit where they're trying to channel the reader along a track of painfully obsolete material that isn't even going to pass muster in relation to the apologetics that's churning around over at Answers in Genesis in regards to their Ark Encounter. Fascinating. But it gets even more fun. He puts up some Robert Carter sideswiping Darwin as to how he supposedly embraced Lamarckian inheritance of acquired characteristics. One of them is a 2011 piece, the Darwin's Lamarckianism Vindicated, which you'll be able to get. I'll put the link up to that. And a 2021, which is The Barrier Has Been Breached. This one was kind of funky because the link to get to it listed in Sarfati's notes had it at creation.com/Wiseman, but that's not how it's listed at CMI's website. It's creation.com, breaching the Wiseman barrier. So I'm assuming that they were correct at the time the book was written, but that the website had been reshuffled over, which is another reason why you have to be very careful about relying upon web links that are given in books, even our books, because the material may get moved to a different web element, which is why we make a point of listing the complete title, author, date, every piece of information that you could do to be able to figure out by other means. If you can't find it, if that link becomes obsolete by the time you're reading the book, well, at least you'll have other information so where you can Google it and find the material if it's still online, which occasionally things might not be. And of course, the stuff that we've drawn attention to in the books that are once used to be online, but nobody's going to be able to see them now because boop, they're gone. That's a matter of the scholarship of the internet, where not everything lasts forever, especially if it's immensely stupid, in which case some people might want to sweep it under the rug. We'll be listing a paper from Blind in 2020, which is discussing that Wiseman barrier, which is the idea that your stem cells, your basic somatic cells, are not germline cells, are the core of things, and then regular somatic cells spread out from them, and it goes in that one direction. Well, we now know it's a bit more complicated than that, and in fact, the Blind paper in 2020 goes into great detail about the history of it, about Wiseman and his germplasm ideas, which is all pre-Mendel, and let alone pre-DNA. Wiseman was explicitly offering it as an alternative to Darwin's similarly preemptive and didn't quite pan out pangenesis ideas, but also specifically a rejection of Lamarckian inheritance. Now, you can then compare the Carter stuff with the material in the Blind to see the difference between a deck stacker ideologue and then the ones that are just trying to pay attention to all the facts. But there's an even more fun part that occurred in that breaching the Wiseman barrier thing, because there were some lines in here that I'm not quoting it in full, and we'll be going into it a little bit more in Rocks for Their Volume 2, because it relates to some of the weirder aspects of creationism in this area. But there's a bit about where he goes on about genomes of people with mixed race ancestry. And I was so struck by this paragraph, which you'll be able to find in the main text. It's a couple pages down, with one little footnote that doesn't really explain a heck of a lot to it. But he's talking about European chromosomes and European family trees as opposed to Black people that might be able to get in there. And it sounded really odd to me. And when I put it up in our little discussion group on Twitter, we got some jaw drops from it. Zach Hancock, who's a biologist and knows about all this material, said he knew that Carter was an idiot, but he hadn't realized that he was a race realist idiot. That there's this strange, weird philosophical mindset that's floating around in there that was actually quite gobsmackingly astonishing for him. Most curious indeed. And that puts a lot of perspective. And I noticed just today I was watching one of Joel Duff's videos on this. What's the easiest way to call them? Christian nationalist, dominionist, racist nutballs from Moscow, Idaho. That Duff was aware of this group predating it, and I bumped into them peripherally. Doug Wilson and his brother Gordon. And they've set up a little university, and there's a whole bunch of stuff going on there down in Moscow, Idaho. And Doug Wilson debated the late Christopher Hitchens about, 15 years ago, something like that. But Wilson is kind of notorious in scholarly circles in that he is a Christian defender of slavery as kind of a really good thing for the slaves. This is an old book that he did, about 30 years ago now, that he tends not to bring up, but they still have very extremist viewpoints on things. And they're now prattling on about politics and how philosophical moral relativism is infecting society and all that. And this is at this kind of meeting, however, that is being hosted at the Ark Encounter. And Ken Ham is supposed to be delivering an address. And so what Duff is quite curious about is to find out, is Ham just hosting this little thing for the money, because it involves hundreds of dollars of entry fees on things. It would be quite expensive, $600 or $700 for a family to be able to attend one of these things. And it is intended as a family thing, although it's also got beer drinking and partying going on. It's very strange. So you get beer and psalms and culture camp extremism all in one delicious package. Oh, hi, Vesta. Yeah, I'm just going in on about our little pals at the Doug Wilson Nutballs down in Moscow, Idaho. And Joel Duff was criticizing them. He's not going to be able to attend their thing, although he would have loved to, at the Ark Encounter. But so the question is whether Ken Ham is buying into any of this stuff, which is creepy, or is he just using the Ark Encounter as a venue to make some money, which is craven and perhaps understandable if they've got some financial difficulties. But the scary theological extremism of Wilson's group, and it's a very incestuous group. I mean, apparently it looks like he's got one of the speakers is Doug Wilson, and one of the speakers is Wilson's brother, and another speaker is the guy that runs their university, who's the president of that, and and Doug Wilson's brother is one of the professors at the university, and one of the speakers is apparently Wilson's son-in-law, who is part of the people involved. So it's a very tight pack of people, and all basically involved in their little cultic group, which I would suspect it would be interesting to see from a methods point of view how insular is their presentation. Are they selling product there, and what kind of material is available? Is the slavery defense book available or not? And how much are they trying to kind of clean away? Well, let me see if I've got the little notes pointing up here. It's the New St. Andrews College. I'll type this in so anybody can take a look at it. New St. Andrews College. Doesn't that sound absolutely wonderful? In Moscow, Idaho. It may or may not be accredited. There are accreditation modes that can occur for Christian colleges, even if they're not necessarily getting accreditation in other contexts. But and so there's Ben Merkel, who's the president, and then there's Toby Sumpter, who's part of the pastor in that network, Gabe Ranch, who's one of the organizers of this Fight, Laugh, Feast show that is doing all of this. So I would call this is like culture camp outreach for the political extremists to interconnect with others to try to spread the word on things. But it would be interesting for anybody that does attend that, which I think is in November, to report on what exactly was said, what information was made available, what information did they not tell about their background, how are they presenting themselves, what's their vibe, et cetera, how well was it attended, was there any pushback from people who have problems with it, or is it basically going to be kind of like an echo chamber environment? All of that is the sort of stuff that a source methods observer reporter would be doing to try to ferret out where they stand on the landscape of things and where they are fitting into this Ark Encounter landscape of defense and enablers. Source methods is all very useful for that. When I've attended various anti-evolution groups, and that's where I got Titan's book, was in one in Idaho, north of Moscow. Moscow, Idaho happens to be a college town, and it's just across the border from Pullman, Washington. And there's the university that's down in Pullman, and then you drive 10 or 15 minutes, and bingo, you're at Moscow's Idaho State University. And I think I bumped into Gordon Wilson, the brother, many years ago. There was a convention of atheist freethinkers that was done for Darwin Day down at the university. And it was nicely attended, and there were a variety of speakers. And I think P.Z. Myers and some others were there. And afterwards, a bunch of us decanted to a local bar, and were chit-chatting back and forth. And I know Doug Wilson was one of the questioners in the audience as a skeptic, being a creationist, so he didn't like the atheist freethinker aspect of it. And he was a fairly amiable little schlub, but clearly not as well informed as he needed to have been, even by that time. This would be about 2013. And he was prattling on about bird evolution and how problematic it was. And he was trying to say, oh, there's this scientist who's proven that the bird feathers can't evolve from scales and all of that. Well, I, by that time, was now increasingly versed in what the apologetics were on the subject, and I immediately recognized the examples that he was talking about. He was talking about Brush's work from the 1990s. And by that time, of course, Brush had already hooked up with Prum, who was another developmental biologist going into the bird evolution feather issue. And by that time, they had moved way beyond the old 1990s material that Gordon was trying to wave at me in absentia down there as we were standing in kind of a alcove in the entrance to this bar. And so by that time, I was getting more and more into source methods to where I would be able to measure and would be going after people at source level to try to locate them on the landscape of things. So that's been the evolution of my methodology from the time when I started out this project in the 1990s to where I was putting it kind of on hiatus for a while, and then got a new computer and found that the internet had changed drastically in the meantime, and now I had access to way more information. So I was now going back into this project, and then over the next 3 or 4 years was escalating to what I would now call the proper source methods approach to this, which is to try to find out what people's sources are. Do they fact check them? Do they even know how to fact check them? How familiar are they with the data field that they would not be familiar with unless they read outside their little box? And so you focus in on diagnostic questions that are bumping into the thing they don't want to think about. This is why I wrote Evolution Slam Dunk on the reptile mammal transition. I pay attention. There's similar litmus tests you can go into on virtually any transitional series like the whales or bird evolution. There is a body of technical literature which is constantly expanding. In the case of whale evolution, it's involving paleontology and it's involving developmental biology to see how the bones and all that develop. It's involving genetics, which is they're looking into what genes exist and what's not. My favorite on the whales, of course, would be to point out that all toothless mammals, including toothless whales, have the genes for tooth enamel in their genomes. It's hasn't been long enough for the editing out process in the biology to get rid of them. And so they're just sitting there like little deactivated fossils. But why would an animal that has no teeth have tooth enamel genes? It's like putting a gas tank on a Tesla. So it just doesn't make a great deal of sense. And that sort of information is not going to be known to the creationist that's reading only from the creationist's churning mill. So the newer sources that's coming in on Sarfati, as I keep on adding all of these creationists in there, we're shooting up close to 80% of their sources so far are just from in-house creationist material. And as you can see from the stuff that I've been putting up for posting, a superficial bunch at that. So I'm going to be seeing how much that's changing when we finally, once we get past chapter 2, when we start actually dealing with the technical arguments. And as I pointed out in one of the guideposts that I've been looking at is, do they really address the potential problems for treating various dinosaur taxa as kinds or not? And do they try to identify which kinds they are? So the sauropods are an interesting little bunch. Are they going to treat them as separate groups? Even within the variety of within, say, the Diplodocids, which being a family would be treated as a single baramin in creationist apologetics, the stuff that would end up at the Ark encounter. But are they going to even get that far? And more interestingly, will they even try to cite any of the creationist literature on the subject? So there's how much of the science material are they going to bump into, and how much of the creationist material are they bumping into, and how much of it's old? The fact that they are devoting not one but 2 chapters to lambasting the bird dinosaur model, that's a lot of chapters, and it's 2022. So that means there's a hell of a lot of technical literature that has come down the pike. And if all they're going to do is retread Alan Fiducia and decades material, I'm going to be looking up to see whether they've got Bullar and others, the work that's been done on the genetics and developmental biology of birds in relation to archosaurs, and all the stuff about skin integuments and all that. That's just been a huge amount of technical literature, quite a chunk of which I cited in Evolution Slam Dunk, and we alluded to some of it in the rocks for there. We'll be able to compare all of that. So all of that's going to be the little multiple layers of analysis that's going in, so that some of it's going to be with an eye on how does it connect up, or does it connect up at all with the baraminology list of kinds that are aboard the Ark according to the Ark encounter. And you'd think, in my initial glance through the book, you'd think that they'd have something so obvious as a list of the kinds, not just the list of the dinosaurs they're going to talk about, but since they are the ones that are pushing kinds, although they don't put a thing of that in their glossary, it's a really superficial glossary that's leading on to that it's going to be a lot of fluff. And I'll be looking to see what all technical science literature has any novelty to it. Is it stuff that's already been churned through the material that's been presented by Sarfati and others over the years, Jerry Bergman? There's been a whole slew of ones. And how obsessive will they be to keep in-house, to keep as close as possible to CMI apologetics? So far, it's been relentlessly CMI apologetics. They're not jumping out to do ICR. They're not jumping out to do Answers in Genesis. They're former kissing cousins there that Ken Ham runs. So that's going to be a really fun one to watch out about. Now, many of you have heard of the smallest basilisaurid. Oh, yes, there was just a brand new paper on that. It's going to be mentioned in Rocks too. That is revealing things about the variety of and spread of the very earliest groups of all of these. And there's so many different taxa and stuff going on. The basilosaurids are ones that look very sinewy. The reason they have that name that sounds like it's the reptile, because it was found at a time before they realized that it wasn't a reptile, that it was a whale. And if you imagine a long mosasaurus-like, snake-like critter with nice teeth in it, it's not like a baleen style or anything like that. Doesn't have echolocation and the stuff that we would associate with some of the cetaceans today. And it had little front flippers, fine and dandy, and still, in depending on the species, vestigial hind legs. Some of the longer basilosaurids still had this. I don't think this little itty bitty one has that element in it, but I'll look through more on the details of the paper. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that there's going to be some spin on this in the creationist literature. They tend to try to sweep away and dismiss and seek up any little fiddly bits on that. If that pops up, then I'll want to cover their coverage of it to see what creationists are paying any attention to it at all. If nobody does mention it, if nobody at ICR or AIG or CMI does, then that's kind of interesting. Joel Duff, who keeps his tabs on a lot of the Ken Ham stuff at AIG, will be a helpful one in that regard. I can see what happens at ICR because I get their acts and facts, and they tend to spittle on about that as well. So it'll be fun to see what all happens on that. And then you've got the CMI gang, which would be the Sarfati cluster. The neat thing about The basilosaurids are that they become global. So they're basilosaurids. I think this smallest one, I can't remember whether this one was found in Africa or whether it was found in South America, because there's some basilosaurids in that found there. So they get all over the place. And the whales as a group apparently are developing in that Tethya Sea that's shrinking as India is about ready to start slamming into Africa and or India, and pushes up the Himalayas and eliminate. That's one of the reasons why so many of these fossils are up in Pakistan, because that they've been pushed up out of their marine environment. So the basilosaurids get around, and then they start only over time are they starting to specialize into the big classification groups that are the toothed whales, and then the toothless ones that develop even farther on. Now, there's a whole bunch of things creationists and intelligent designers like to go ballistic about, like how do they develop blubber? How did they develop their suckling systems? What kinds of stuff for the echolocation? All of these things that are supposedly irreducibly complex. Gunter Beckley is supposed to be doing a paper with some of their bunch over at the Discovery Institute, and this one has been now years in the making, that we haven't seen hide nor hair of it yet. So yes, indeed. Oh yeah. Well, he's a very amiable fellow. He's a religious believer, so he is not one of these snarky atheists like this old fart here. He's somebody that's looking at it from a fellowship from the same faith, and as a consequence, he's not only disgruntled at their pseudoscience ignorance, but he's also troubled if they also have a sign that they are bigots and political extremists. And the Doug Wilson case, to pull it circle to our topic, is part of that group. And what's unclear, because a lot of them keep under the radar on a lot of things, is just how far spread this political extremism is in anti-evolutionism. I think a relative measure of it can be thought of in terms of how it translates into the political realm already. That if you remember the political demographic of Donald Trump's evangelicals, these are, by and large, very extremist viewpoints. And they don't always rant off on about it. And sometimes they insist they're not political extremists. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene doesn't think of herself in that term, at which point you're going, but that's how that works. When you think of somebody like Kent Hovind, who is an extreme right-wing dominionist clod. For those of you who don't know the little names, there's dominionism, which sounds like what it is. The Christians really ought to be running all the show. And one of the characters that pops up here is Rushdoony. He's dead now. He's been dead for actually quite a few years, but there are an awful lot of Rushdoonyites lurking around there. And some of them follow his extremist views. A lot of his books are available online. You can download an awful lot of coverage on it. And I've been accumulating quite a lot of material on it over the years. It percolates through a lot of areas. D. James Kennedy, who was some of the ones that was connecting up with the down in Coral Ridge Ministries, and I think he's been dead now for about a decade. His a bunch has dominionist connections, of course Kent Hovind, his bunch, and all that, and this Doug Wilson crowd and all that. So there's various little niche subsections in it, but it's been going on. It's not something that's come out of the woodwork just now. It's been percolating for years and years and years. I remember Doug Wilson's book on this was back in the 1990s. So this stuff has been marinating quite a long time in the fringe areas of creationism and in the fringe areas of political parties, usually, although not absolutely, in the Republicans, and more so as racist Democrats left and became racist Republicans. Some of them pop up. It's no coincidence that a bunch of them are in Idaho, because that's been a haven for decades for political extremism. Oh, yes. Well, that's yet another interesting little topic come on. There we go. A Discovery Institute and the Prager University. Yes, this shows one of the future books that I plan on doing will be to take the material from tip 1.6, 1.7, and the never done tip 1.8, which covers the history of creationism and its role in trying to co-opt education. That I've continued to glom onto a lot of material that's going to fit into that, and that'll eventually be the book Kulturkampf, which will go into all of that. That'll be one I'll be dealing with after we finished with a bunch of other books with Jackson. So, I mean, this is farther down the road. But at any rate, for those unfamiliar with this episode of who's, what, and where, PragerU is this hyper-conservative bunch of ideologues who have just had a bunch of their propaganda videos made available for schools in Ron DeSantis's Florida. And this is the sort of stuff that argues that, they would have Christopher Columbus saying that slavery wasn't really all that bad for people. And even as has Frederick Douglass supposedly expressing viewpoints like that. I mean, and if you look very closely, I think Candace Owens did one of their videos. And of course, they've embraced intelligent design. Steve Meyer did a video for them. I don't know that there's any indication yet that the DeSantis education nutballs are going to try to push PragerU intelligent design material into their science classes. But is anybody going to be surprised if they do that? I won't be. It'll be completely in tune with what we've got going. Now, every one of their squibs are theoretically accessible for source analysis. And I had already been paying attention to a little bit of their stuff because it fits into that Kulturkampf theocratic mentality that you find with David Barton, the pseudo-historian. He's in that same kind of venue of trying to show how Christian the nation was and that we're all falling away from the proper virtues of things. But it's what they leave out that's so critical. The little one that was on slavery made a great point about that slavery, we didn't invent it. It goes back thousands of years, and there are Muslims who had slaves, and they make a great deal about that, but not about Christians having slaves and the role of Christianity in the group. And that kind of revisionism is not helping students understand anything. You can look at an interesting group that are the Quakers. The Quakers eventually became stridently anti-slavery along with being pacifists. And they would get into trouble with the various draft boards during World War I and World War II over that kind of stuff. But back in the early stages of Quakerism in the 18th and early 19th century, they were in fact quite knee-deep into the slave trade. And they had a big crisis in their church over this issue as they began to think, this is not really good to do. And so they started weaning themselves off of that and became eventually very much an abolitionist party. The complexity of issues involved, and not everyone who was in favor of abolishing slavery believed in the equality of the races, although there were some who did that. But move over to the Kulturkampf conservatives, the very sorts of minds that would be anti-evolutionist and anti-abortion and anti-gay rights and anti-union and anti-climate change and anti-vaccines for COVID virus. That mentality in the 19th century would be pro-slavery, anti-abolitionism. They would be infuriated at the cultural modernity. My God, if you're going to have blacks free, what are you going to want to have women voting? Are you going to have society turned upside down? Are you going to have just mob rule? Boy, that's being woke. Wow, we don't want that. That the kinds of hysterical reactionary attitudes of people in 1850 and 1860 is eerily reminiscent of the stuff that we see today. It's just slightly changed in sort of the terminology. And other than the Doug Wilsons, who have a history of defending slavery, I don't think PragerU thinks slavery is a good thing, but they're jolly evasive about dealing with that history of it. One time I was a slave owner, but the time being out. Yes, and you get a big turnover of things in that area. Now, what's fun is looking at you, the aspects of this in relation to the abolitionist movement, and that's another area where the Christian conservatives want to hijack it entirely as a Christians abolishing slavery thing. And certainly you have that Bishop Wilberforce, who is the one of the drivers in this in the early stages. But you have to remember what kind of Christian he was. He wasn't Church of England. He was part of that little freethinker bunch. And of course, his son, I think, or grandson, was the one that complained about Darwin in a much later period. But if you look at that environment that had what we would call today liberal Christians, and typically not Church of England establishment types. These were not people who were all that fond of traditional aristocracy and traditional authority, although some of them could be landed aristocrats like the Darwin crowd. But the Wedgwood set that Darwin married into, they had a bunch of very egalitarian, strong-willed women, so there was a freethinker aspect and equality issues going on in there. I'd recommend that everyone read Darwin's Sacred Cause, which is about the Darwin family and all of that connection with the Wedgwoods and that and their anti-slavery positions. And it's a great one because it's got an awful lot of society information on the culture of the period. You had others who were much iffier. George Lyell, who was, I think his name is George. Maybe not. Anyway, but Lyell, the geology friend of Darwin. But Lyell was quite a political conservative. Oh, and a believer in sea monsters. One of the things that pops up in Rocks 2 will be about the curious things of who was thinking that there might be remnant reptiles, plesiosaurs, still alive. And I think Richard Owen was somebody who didn't believe in surviving plesiosaurs, whereas Lyell was kind of okay with the subject. And so you get some curious juxtapositions of positions on these little things. But anyway, yes, I'd strongly recommend that as a wonderful book. Yes, I grew up as an Anglican. Yes, I have a little bit for those who have been following my Paralogues of Phileas Fogg story. And why wouldn't you want to buy all of my books, including the fiction works? Shameless plug moment. By the way, I do put links in all the videos to this, so you just go clickety-poo if you want some summer reading. But I have a scene in the second Paralogues of Fogg novel, not the Columbia, the Under the Southern Double Cross, where I'm having a party in Melbourne in 1873 that's kind of seeing off this local jurist who's very religiously devout, and he's going on a sabbatical for a year to go back to Ireland and learn about his roots and convive with the faithful and that in his background. And this, by the way, is a real character, and you know, half of the people at this party are real people at this real club. So I had a lot of fun folding in the stuff about the newspaper people and who was running for what political office and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, he was very devout as a person. And I have him asking Phileas Fogg what scriptures were his guide going around the world to keep him sustained. And of course, Fogg didn't take a Bible with him. No, he had Bradshaw's Railway Guide. And so this was beginning to think that this Phileas Fogg fellow might not be a religious believer. And of course, his wife, Aouda, in my story, has no religious affiliation as well. So neither one of them certainly are Church of England. But that stratification, remember, it was only in that post-1830s period, as you're moving into the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that you find emancipation starting up for Catholics in Britain, to where Catholics could then run for public office. And eventually you get some more prominent folk, whereas back in the Tudor period, they were burning out and chopping the heads off of Catholics, and then the Catholics were given in charge again with Queen Mary, and you would be chopping off the heads of Protestants. It was a bloody mess, terribly, terribly bad. And of course, the whole Republic period, the Commonwealth, was political religious extremism as well. The Puritans got such a pissant thing that people went off and went elsewhere. Now, an awful lot of political religious extremists just left the country. So the Puritans and others that came over here, they weren't believers in religious freedom. They were wanting to be free from other people's religion and free to oppress everybody else and hold them to this. So they were not particularly believers in religious freedom. The ones that stayed behind and had to assimilate and get structured were often in the reformist branch of things. And so there's this tendency to be the boat rocker on the religion front can, in a different personality, take a very politically liberal approach to things. And so the traditionalists in the Church of England are the ones that are supporting the aristocratic mindset. They're the ones that are supporting the slaveholders. Lyle was one of those who was much friendlier. He went on a tour in America, I think in like 1859 or 60. And he was not at all wanting for social revolution. And so all of that political dynamic that's going on is exactly the sort of thing that makes it far richer to understand what was going on during that mid-19th century, the tumultuous abolition of slavery and war and modernism and all these things. But you're not going to get that at PragerU. You're going to get a cartoon. And it's a tidy, condensed, apologetically naive, evasive cartoon. And the kinds of leaving things out that don't fit is exactly what they're doing with intelligent design. So this is a funky little area where those who want to play the explore the details game, that want to dive into this, do it. Do a video analyzing a Prager video or their publications. They've got website material that you can glom onto. Pick a topic and run with it. If you have a historical mind, clearly they're going into an awful lot of stuff on politics. A similar thing was happening under the Trump administration, and I think they're still kind of pushing it. It was the response to the 1619 project, which I think they call it the 1776 project. And it's basically a glee club approach to the past in the same way that Prager University's videos are. And it's a relevant point if you look at the difference between a 1619, which was accused never of actually having any factual inaccuracies. All the events they were highlighting were real. The only quibbles that historians had with them is whether or not they were cherry picking things or leaving out stuff, in particular in relation to the complexity of the slave issue in the Revolutionary period, and then the thing leading up to the Civil War as to how it was playing a much bigger role in a discussion of what was tearing the country apart than the 1619 project was willing to look at, where they're trying to put everything back in this slavery as the driver component and no other forces are involved. But in the leaving out department, oh, hi, Lavender. You're one of my supporters. I will shout it out, everybody, in the beginning of the show. In fact, one of the things I'm pondering doing after Titans is one of these stupid works that connects up to the worldview of the culture camp conservatives. I bumped into a little ways ago online, and it had to do with a book by this Rothbard guy who died in the 1990s, The Progressive Era, and it's was waved at me as being such an important, impactful book. And I went yeah, a lot. There's so many developments in this, just as you've got this current fracas with the anyway, I'm thinking that may be the next book on the line, because even though it's not a science work, it's a source methods analysis as to what they bring out and what they don't. But the Anglicans operating that way. In the Southern Baptist Convention, which has just been going through a convulsion over whether or not they would ever allow women communicants and the like in it. The reason why there's a Southern Baptist Convention is because of the Civil War. The slavery issue split the Baptists, which were just part of a single blob, and the Northern Baptists thought slavery was not a good idea, and the Southern slaveholding Baptists thought that it was okay. And so away they go. um, that those sorts of things you can't disconnect from all of those historical contexts, like about the Quakers, the evolution of them. You find a similar dynamic that goes on in elements of the Catholic Church, where you've got a spectrum from hyper conservative Pope Benedict style ones, and even beyond that, if you look at Alan Keyes and some of the anti-evolution Catholics, these are people who don't like Vatican II. These have been objecting to any reforms or modernization of the church, and some that are still do the church in Latin, for example. But then this can go all the way out on the other end of the spectrum. And it's not too often you find a church that has this wide of a range of the liberation theology, crypto-Marxist branch of Catholicism. And but in many ways, that shouldn't surprise us, because it's in so many countries and it has such a huge tradition in so many different areas. And it's had time to marinate in so many different fissioning ways, a much bigger market penetration than a lot of the Protestants. By comparison, you get in some ways a shorter frame, but a little bit of that goes on in the Mormon Church, where you have a very defined dogma, but you've also got spectrums where you have from quite conservative Mormons out to kind of liberal ones. And so it's got a complicated little range that goes on there. That, I think, is fueled in part from the very fact that the Mormons are such a minority and have been a persecuted minority within relatively recent times, that they've always got kind of a aversion to authority in the same way that Seventh-day Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses and those are. And you often find those groups finding common cause with the American atheists and the humanists and all of that on prayers in the schools and other things. I noticed that in the Grease v. Galloway case that I had been studying. That was the occasion of my little first debate that I had done on that one. So if you're thinking, my gosh, these subjects are kind of complicated and varied, well, that's because they are. And kind of get used to it. But unlike the historical exercises of the past that are to understand what causes what and who was doing what to what, these modern issues have an impact, because people in states are voting, people in states are denying elections, they're trying to invent fake electors. If you look at the kind of mindset that a Matt Gaetz or a Marjorie Taylor Greene have, a Carrie Lake, even though she lost her bid for governor, she's smooching with a bunch of people in various political groups. So they haven't gone away. And I would, again, suggest that anybody that was planning on attending that Ark Encounter Wilson fracas pay attention to the political networks and what they're connecting up with and not, because some of this can really matter. The stakes in maintaining the republic and peace and tranquility and progress, in my view, are rather too high to let people who can't figure out whether there were dinosaurs on Noah's Ark make decisions for everybody. And that would be easier to identify if you ask more source methods questions of people before they get elected, rather than waiting for the shit to hit the fan and them being in political office. And so I find it reprehensible that we don't have a clearer idea of what the actual views of most politicians are on so many benchmark issues, everything from the nuts and bolts of how old the earth is and Big Bang and whether evolution is true, out through issues about egalitarian rights, but also economic issues about what's the role of taxation and progressive taxation issues, and then ultimately what sources are they relying on. So the average ideologue who's utterly convinced, I don't think for a moment Marjorie Taylor Greene has any doubt whatsoever that everything she believes is true. The question is, based on what? And you'll find when you start scratching a methods base that they're paying attention to an extremely narrow data field. They don't fact check that data field. And typically the data field they're relying on, they don't fact check themselves. And so this incestuous daisy chain, absolutely identical methodologically to what we're seeing in the creationism issues that I'm bringing out. The one little minor detail one could note about, say, the Trump years is that because Trump is a scientific illiterate, he could care less about evolution issues. Although I could easily see that if he thought he could get votes by making an issue out of it, he would. And there are certainly enough creationists in the Trump support base that he could probably have a demographic on that. But they're far more concerned about abortion and gay rights and trans issues. These are the eye twitchy obsessions of the moment, that and critical race theory, that sort of stuff. That it's way on the back burner. But do I think that they wouldn't try to put it on the front burner if they ever got in bigger charge? I'm afraid so. And it's always a not impossibility that an anti-evolution statute could be put in a state. There's a whole bunch of ones that get constantly churned around in Arkansas and Louisiana and Kentucky and various other spots. They tend not to even make it out of committee, but some of these things could make it up, or only one of them would need to make it up, to put a Supreme Court test to have them overturn Edwards v. Aguilar. And since Scalia, the late Scalia that was replaced, I think, by Kavanaugh, was a dissenter in that case back in the 1980s, and that's a decade after Roe v. Wade. So it's a much more recent precedent. Do I have any confidence that the Coulter-Camp Federalist Society ideologues on the court might not overturn it and allow not intelligent design, young earth creationism to be taught in public schools, deciding that Edwards v. Aguilar was wrongly decided and throw it back to the states in the same way that they've done with Dobbs? I have no tremendous confidence that that can't occur, even regardless of who wins the presidency in 2024. This is a ticking time bomb that could potentially come through any one of the states. So that's having fun. Anyway, in Spokane, we were hopefully some of the fires. We got 3 big fires, maybe a 4th one running in the region. We've had some winds that have caused stuff to flit all over the place. Here, the air was so gicky for a while. We were in hazardous territory, but now it's down to just not good. And hopefully the winds and things that they'll be able to get some catch on. But all of these major fires that we've got going, they're not super gigantic yet, but they're also not contained either. So they've had to evacuate sections of Eastern Washington University out in Cheney. And I've seen no indication, at least today, that nothing got fired. There's not anything in the college that has been burned. But nonetheless, we'll find out what's going on tomorrow. And then I understand that in addition to the hurricane Hillary, that kind of ameliorated a little bit because it went inland on a track that tends to defuse stuff. But they had an earthquake, a 5.1 earthquake in Los Angeles, just on top of everything else. So have fun down living in California. Let's see what else can we have going on. Can we have like killer seals or something attacking up in Marin County? Maybe we can have some new developments. But anyway, have a Sharknado or something. So anyway, we're just about in an actual full hour. It was glad to see Central BC is basically on fire. Yes, indeed. And that was the thing that is still running amok. The tinderbox circumstances, fires like that with huge temperature differentials that dry things out more and more, longer and longer, hotter and hotter. There's some worries among some climatologists that we're going to be looking back on the hot temperatures of 2023 as the cool times in the summer. We'll see what happens on that stuff. So anyway, stuff to deal with for the next few decades. Yay! Oh, and the Russian probe that was sent to the moon apparently crashed. So much more for Russian science technology. Yes. So I'm going to cut it off there. Everybody, make sure that whatever penguins that you do not accept any wooden ones, but also make sure that none of them are on fire. That's highly unrecommended. Oh, let me call up my cute little rocks flyer here. We'll do our shameless plug. Put that on little pause. Takes a while for little Jimmy with his little buttons to find all my stuff. There we go. Okay. I guess that'll work. This is the book. It's a good book. We're very proud of it. It's just a pile up of wonderful sources. And volume 2 is going to be more wonderful sources. And while you're at it, get Evolution Slam Dunk. And while you're at it, if you want some good reading for the summer, pick up the Paralogs of Fog book. There's humor, there's history, there's mystery, there's science fiction. I'm with it. So the old RJ can use the royalties on them all, and you'll get a good read. And there's our little clickety-click. All the links to all the books, fiction and nonfiction, are all in the links to the video that I put in after it's posted, and we get all that out of the way. So it's as easy as clickety-click, whoop, and away we go. We're hoping to get the volume 2 of the Roxford there out next year. And with a little luck, either 24 or 25, the third of the Paralog series, the Jewels to the Flame. That one will be, it'll bring us up into 1879, and then more to go. And there will be 9, count them, 9 additional Paralogs novels after that, for a whole big round dozen by the time I'm done with them, by which time I will be 207 years old and slightly more decayed than I am now. So anyway, everybody stay safe and cool and not burnt up and not earthquaked and wooden penguin free. See you all next week.